I have to start today's video with a disclaimer. Don't go to Dudleytown, Connecticut. This is not a prank, it's not a stunt, it's not clickbait, it's the truth. I'm confident that at the end of this video, there are going to be people that want to go. Don't do it. One, it's illegal to go to Dudleytown, it's private property. And two, as you'll see in today's video, there is a reason why people abandoned Dudleytown. It is not a safe place for people. But before we get into the story about Dudleytown, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is playing an intense game of online FIFA, wait until they get the lead and then unplug their Wi-Fi. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was a bright summer day in 1906, and Dr. William C. Clark and his wife Harriet were driving slowly through a beautiful part of northwestern Connecticut called Litchfield County. Litchfield is a rural, very hilly area with lots of winding country roads, and the Clarks were there to try to scout out an area to build their second home. The couple lived full-time in New York City, where Dr. Clark was an oncologist, which is a cancer doctor, and he was also a professor at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. And while the Clarks' lives were very exciting and fulfilling in the city, they were also very hectic and chaotic, and so the reason they had settled on Litchfield as the place to look for a location for their second home is because it was the total opposite of the city. It was quiet, it was peaceful, it was perfect. And so as this couple from New York City drove along these winding backcountry roads, they eventually reached this beautiful covered wooden bridge, and after they drove across it, they got this view up onto this mountainside off to their right, and high up on this mountain was this huge, shaded, beautiful forest. And they saw there was a road that appeared to kind of spider off and go into these woods. Now, the couple had no idea what was up there, but it was just so beautiful, and they were immediately so drawn to it that they decided they would go check it out and see if maybe there was a spot for their second home in these woods. And so Dr. Clark took the car and he went up this access road, and very quickly as they began climbing up this hillside, the road became very bumpy and overgrown. It was pretty obvious that not many cars were driving into these woods, and so before they even reached the tree line, Dr. Clark had to pull the car over and park it on the side of the road, and then he and Harriet got out, and then on foot they continued up towards the forest. And once the couple actually entered the forest, immediately the sunlight faded because the canopy over their heads was so thick, and the air became cool and refreshing. And after walking for only a couple of minutes, the forest, which at first seemed very still and quiet, suddenly became alive. They could hear birds chirping and animals running around and insects buzzing. And then up ahead, they saw there was this field off to the side of the road that was full of all these wild apple trees growing in all different directions. And as they got closer, they saw there was just a deer right in the middle of the apple trees eating apples directly off the branches. And then just past all these apple trees, the couple began passing these huge, beautiful patches of roses and lilacs and bright yellow bitter tansy flowers that lined the road. And then before long, the couple was stepping over these babbling brooks, and off in the distance, they could hear the sound of running water like fresh spring water coming down off the mountain. And then, as the sun did begin to poke through the canopy above them, it almost looked like the forest was sparkling, literally. This forest was sitting on a hillside, and the hillside, which was made up of rock, had mica inside of it. And mica is a kind of mineral that when sunlight hits it, it almost looks like it's shimmering. And of course, there were the owls. As Dr. Clark and his wife walked farther and farther into this beautiful forest, they heard more and more owls hooting off in the distance. And to the Clarks, this made the forest feel enchanted. It was like the owls were personally greeting them. By the time the couple had turned around and begun heading back to their car, they had already made up their mind that they were going to build their second home in that forest. And so, after returning to their home in New York, they promptly put in the paperwork to purchase 1,000 acres inside of that Connecticut forest. And that forest had a name. It was called Dark Entry, and it was named that because it looked like from the outside, the forest was basically dark all the time. There was shade cast on it from mountains nearby, and then also the canopy inside of Dark Entry is exceptionally thick. At one time, there actually had been a town inside of Dark Entry Forest. However, all the people who had lived in that town were now all gone. The only remnants of this town were a couple of crumbling stone walls and a couple of home foundations that were scattered about the Dark Entry forest floor. The Clarks had seen some of these ruins as they walked along this overgrown path through the forest, but they weren't concerned. Instead, they felt like these ruins actually added some charm to the forest. After the land purchase was finalized, Dr. Clark began looking for local builders in Connecticut who could help him build this second home inside of Dark Entry Forest. But no matter how much money he offered these local Connecticut builders, they all said no. Now, none of them gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they were turning him down. So Dr. Clark just kind of assumed that, hey, this project is not huge. It's just one house. And the forest is pretty isolated and hard to get to. And so he thought, probably these builders think it's not worth the effort. But Dr. Clark was not discouraged. He decided he would just build the house himself. After all, he was a very handy, competent guy who had grown up on a farm in New Jersey, and so he knew how to build things. And so, for the next several months, Dr. Clark would travel from New York City to Dark Entry Forest every weekend, and he would build this home. First, he cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees on this one flat patch of his land, and then with all this lumber he had cut down, he built his rustic two-story cabin on this flat part of his land. And then nearby on this hilltop, there was a freshwater spring at the top, and so he laid piping from the spring into his cabin so they could have fresh water. And then at the bottom of this nearby hill was this brook, and Dr. Clark loved just standing and watching this brook because inside of it were all these trout that would dart all around. And so Dr. Clark built a swimming pool with beautiful mossy embankments right up against this brook so he could sit there and watch the fish. By Thanksgiving of that year, the cabin was done, and so Dr. Clark and his wife Harriet, they stayed at the cabin to celebrate the holiday. And as they were sitting in their swimming pool watching the trout and listening to the owls hoot off in the distance, they both agreed that this second home was like their little piece of heaven. So every summer from there on out, and every major holiday that they could manage it, the Clarks would travel to their home in Dark Entry Forest, and they would swim and hike and relax, and they'd watch the leaves on the mountainside turn from green to bright yellows and oranges and reds. It was perfect. That is, until 1918. That summer, the couple was in their second home in the forest when Dr. Clark was suddenly called back to New York to attend to a medical emergency. Harriet was very upset at the prospect of suddenly being left alone in this cabin in the middle of the forest by herself for who knows how many days. And so when she dropped her husband off at the nearby train platform, she made him promise that he would come back soon. And he said he would. And then Dr. Clark got on the train, it took off, and Harriet just stood there with her arms crossed, watching it as it chugged along off into the distance. From his comfortable seat on that train, Dr. Clark had no idea that his wife was about to endure a nightmare while he was gone. We've all been there. Your guests are on their way over to your house for your big New Year's Eve party, and right as they pull into your driveway, you realize you've overnogged your smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog. And so with minutes to spare, you leap out of the window, shattering the glass and cutting yourself up badly, and then you jog up to Canada and dive into Baffin Bay, and you jump on top of a narwhal, and after some intense underwater hand-to-flipper combat, you take its horn off its head, and you beat it to death. You take its horn, and then you swim back to land, and you jog back to your house, and you leap in through a different window, shattering the glass, and then after you stand up, you make your way into the kitchen, and you whip up a quick narwhal horn iced soup right as your guests are walking through the front door. Crisis averted, right? Wrong. Smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog and narwhal horn iced soup are both just gross, so your party was doomed either way. But you know what isn't gross? HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal service that delivers actually good-tasting food right to your doorstep. With over 35 recipes available every week, there is something to please everyone. Choose from family-friendly, fit and wholesome, even veggie. Plus, you can easily customize your meals or sides, upgrading your proteins, or even adding a protein to your veggie meal. And if you're going to be traveling this New Year's, HelloFresh can accommodate your schedule. You can change your preferences, delivery day, and your address in just a few clicks. So, if you're ready to stop garnishing your holiday parties with trash food and drink, then sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Okay, back to the story. When the Clarks bought their 1,000 acres in the Dark Entry Forest, they did virtually no research on the forest or the surrounding area. If they had, they very likely would not have purchased that land. You see, the town that used to be inside of the Dark Entry Forest, that was now just ruins that the Clarks saw when they first walked around inside of the forest, was abandoned for a very specific reason. It was cursed. At least that's what the locals say. And in fact, that was the reason why no builders in the area were willing to go with Dr. Clark into the forest to go build his house, because they were too scared to go anywhere near the ruins of this cursed town. This town, which was known as Dudleytown, was first settled sometime in the 1740s. At first, it was just a couple of people and a couple of small structures, but pretty quickly, 30 families had moved in, and it was a thriving little town. But as the 1700s came to a close, terrible things began to happen to residents of this town. First, there was the Carter family. They moved to Dudleytown in 1759, and shortly after arriving there, 6 members of their family all died suddenly from cholera. The remaining branch of the Carter family was so grief-stricken from their losses that they left Dudleytown and went to New York, where they resettled. But almost immediately after getting set up there, Native Americans raided their property and massacred them, and the 3 people that survived this massacre were 3 of the kids, and they were all kidnapped and taken away. In 1792, a Dudley resident named Hollister died suddenly. Now, we don't know if he fell off a roof or if he was murdered. No one really knows. But what we can agree on is that his untimely death happened in the home of a man named Tanner. And Tanner, following Hollister's death, suddenly just began obsessively talking about these strange creatures he was seeing out in the woods at night, kind of roaming around the Dark Entry Forest. And he talked about it all the time, and nobody listened to him. And eventually, Tanner went insane, and his daughter had to care for him for the rest of his life. And while Tanner was slowly losing his mind, his next-door neighbor, named Abel, also began reporting that he was seeing weird creatures roaming around the tree line all around the town. And as Abel continued to report seeing these strange creatures lurking in the shadows, he too slowly went mad and had to be cared for until his death. In the early 1800s, a famous Revolutionary War hero, General Herman Swift, who lived in Dudleytown, lost his mind shortly after his wife was struck by lightning. And then, in 1813, an unknown epidemic rolled through Dudleytown and killed many of its residents. After that, more and more residents of Dudleytown either died suddenly or died mysteriously, and also more and more residents began coming forward with stories about having seen these strange, shadowy creatures moving around the tree line at night. By about 1900, all the Dudleytown residents had either died or simply just left, abandoning their homes, except for one family, the Brophies. But in quick succession, the Brophy family's sheep all died, then the mother died of tuberculosis, then the 2 sons were accused of theft in a nearby town, and then they just disappeared, leaving one person, John Brophy, the father. But the Brophy family home burned to the ground, and so John, who was overcome with grief, just wandered off into the forest and was never heard from again. At that point, Dudleytown officially became a ghost town. No one lived there. And it was at that point, in 1906, when Dr. Clark and Harriet had their beautiful summer's day walk through the forest and discovered where they wanted to build their second home. So, fast forward back to 1918, and Dr. Clark, he's on his medical emergency leave to New York. It winds up being very quick. He's back on a train within 36 hours, and he pulls into the station right near Dark Entry Forest, and he's expecting to see Harriet waiting on the platform for him. But when the train rolled into the station, she wasn't there. Now, Dr. Clark was not a superstitious person, but for some reason, when he didn't see his wife there, he just felt like something was off. There's no reason she wouldn't have come out here to greet him. I mean, she was worried about being all alone in the cabin, and she knew he was going to be arriving at that moment. And so, feeling a little bit panicked, Dr. Clark left the train station and on foot made his way over to the Dark Entry Forest. And when he got there and began walking on that overgrown road path that led to his house, immediately, as soon as he was within the shade of the trees, he began hearing these owls hooting very loudly off in the distance. Now, normally, the sound of these owls hooting made him feel welcome, but this time he felt scared. He felt like something was wrong up ahead. And so he began jogging through the forest, and it's very dark, and all he can hear is the sound of these owls, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. And then finally, he reaches the clearing where his property is. And at this point, it's a cacophony of owls hooting practically right on top of him. And he looks up towards his house up on this hill, and he sees the front door is slightly open. And so now, with his heart racing, wondering what's going on with his wife, Dr. Clark runs up to his front porch. He gets to the door, and he flings it open the rest of the way. And then right before he stepped into his house, this sudden high-pitched noise began up on the second floor inside of his house. And it was so startling to Dr. Clark that he just froze where he was. And so suddenly it's so loud from the owls all around him and the woods behind him and whatever this noise is that he just stood there unsure what to do. And so as he's sitting there getting the courage up to go investigate his house, he realizes what this high-pitched noise is. It's the sound of maniacal, insane laughter coming from the second floor. Sensing his wife had to be in danger, the doctor charged up the nearby steps up to the second floor, and he could tell this laughter, this high-pitched laughter, was coming from the master bedroom. And so he ran down the short hallway, he got in front of the closed door that led into the master bedroom, he slowly opened it up, and there, in the back corner of his room, was his wife. She was on the ground, rolled up in a ball, facing the door. Her hands were clenched in fists, her eyes were open and unblinking, and her mouth was open wider than was humanly possible. And as he's staring at his wife, wondering what's going on, he realizes this insane, high-pitched laughter is coming from his wife. But it doesn't even look like it's coming out of her. Her chest is just heaving, her mouth is staying open, and the laughter is just coming out of her. And so the doctor just stood there watching his wife, who's staring directly at his eyes. And finally, he just got so scared, he turned and he ran. During Dr. Clark's 36 hours he was away in New York, something happened to his wife. We don't know what it was, but it caused her to lose her mind. The only thing she would talk about was the strange creatures she saw out in the forest. By some accounts, Harriet spent the rest of her life in a mental asylum. By other accounts, she went back with Dr. Clark to New York, where she took her life. Today, Dudleytown is not only still abandoned, but it is also illegal to visit. However, people do still sneak into Dudleytown and walk around the ruins, and many of them have reported feeling these pockets of cold air where there shouldn't be cold air, and also some others have said, as they've been walking, they've felt phantom hands slap them and push them. Some have said they've taken photographs inside of the Dark Entry Forest near Dudleytown, and they've captured strange, shadowy figures that they couldn't see with their naked eye. The famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, shot a special series in the 1970s inside of the Dark Entry Forest, and they declared the area around Dudleytown was demonically possessed. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is playing an intense game of online FIFA, wait until they take the lead and then unplug the Wi-Fi. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put out the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and it is available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims victims of violent crime, as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on Facebook, TikTok, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In today's top story, we're reminded why truth is often stranger than fiction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a beer and then give them an O'Doul's. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In the spring of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning, she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night, she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that, yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified, but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again. But then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, 1, everything is locked, but 2, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and 2, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. but then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote, and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so, frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV, because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so, in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out, and it's this huge relief, because suddenly, with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I got to tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on the specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house, and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the two brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe. And then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor. And then she hears the TV turn on. And her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off, because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. Then he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear, and she gets up as slowly as she can, and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence, and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him, and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone, and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm going to hang up and call the police, and I'm going to call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now, confirmed. They are right downstairs, and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified, as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you looked through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket, and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud, and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing, and she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole, and standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound, and he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head. And it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. In February of 2013, a young woman named Kim finally moved out of her parents' house, and she moved into this tiny little apartment that she absolutely loved. Kim had severe social anxiety. She could not stand being out in public, talking to people she didn't know. And so she would do everything in her power to stay indoors. She had a job that didn't require her to travel. And so having this little apartment was like her little oasis. When she was there, she was safe. If she had to leave, she was practically running to her car and running back so she didn't have to talk to anybody. In those first few weeks she was living there, as much as she tried to avoid all contact with other people, there was one person she was kind of forced to have an interaction with, and that was her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this awesome old woman named Olivia, who really took a liking to Kim and kind of looked at Kim as like her daughter. And Kim was surprised at herself for wanting to interact with Olivia. She was very comforting and she was this really nice lady. And so even though they didn't actually interact that much, they developed this relationship where Olivia liked to make food, and she'd come over to Kim's door and she'd knock and she'd leave it outside of her door, and she didn't expect Kim to come out and talk to her. She knew Kim was uncomfortable being out in public, and so she didn't push her to do that. Instead, she just expected her to eat some nice food, and whenever Kim was done eating, to put her dishes back outside the door, and Olivia would take it up and she would go clean it, and that was that. And so Kim really grew to love Olivia and was very happy to have her there. It was like she made her feel safe. 2 months after moving into this tiny little new apartment, Kim started taking a new medication for her anxiety. Now, historically, she had taken a whole bunch of different medications and knew when you start a new one, it's not uncommon to have a whole bunch of side effects that you're just not used to, and they're kind of awful, and you need some time to get used to them. So at the same time she's taking this new medication, she starts to notice that she's forgetting things. Things in her apartment are being put in places she does not remember putting them. And things are going missing and she can't remember where she put them. And so even though she was expecting side effects from this new drug, she was really frustrated with the memory loss. She also noticed this medication made her exceptionally drowsy to the point where most days she had to take a nap for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day just to get through the day. Because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, she did not want to go to the doctors to get a different prescription or to even talk to the doctor about, is this normal? Because that doctor's visit would necessitate a whole bunch of interactions with people she doesn't want to interact with. And so she decided, you know what? I'm just going to take my medication. I'm going to let myself adjust to this new normal and everything will be just fine. During the time period that she's experiencing all these side effects that she is attributing to her new medication, she got a delivery from Olivia. It was a Greek salad that she knew Kim loved, and Kim's psyched about this Greek salad. She brings it in her apartment and she decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a nice day to myself. I'm going to go in my bedroom. I'm going to turn on Netflix and I'm going to eat this salad in bed. It's going to be awesome. And so she's sitting in bed, she's eating her salad, she's watching Portlandia, and then she falls asleep right in the middle. Like as she's eating her salad, she's falling asleep. She's so tired. When she woke up, she's like, wow, I've never fallen asleep that hard and that fast before. And she's literally still got the fork in her hand from eating her salad. And then she notices on the other side of the bed, the left side of the bed, the sheets are all disturbed, like someone has been laying there. And Kim always sleeps on the right side of the bed. It was almost like a compulsion for Kim that she could never sleep on the left side, like it was bad luck. And she reaches her hand out and she feels that side of the bed where it's been disturbed and it's still warm. And so she quickly thinks to herself, well, I guess I must have rolled over and laid on that side of the bed and then rolled back to this side, just miraculously right back in the same position I was in with the salad fork still in hand. And that's when it kind of clicks in her head, like, that's not possible. That's not possible. So what does that mean? Does that mean someone's in my apartment right now? And so she leaps out of bed, she gets her phone, she enters 911 and she's ready to dial it, and she flips on all the lights in her apartment, she's running around and there's no one in her apartment. The apartment's still locked, everything is normal. And so she puts her phone away and her heart's still racing. She's very stressed out about what's just occurred. Because in her mind, in the back of her mind anyways, she knows she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is when Kim began to wonder, are all these strange happenings in my apartment connected to what just happened now? Because this incident right here does not feel medication side effect driven. And so all of a sudden she's looking at the other weird things in her apartment, like the missing toothbrush and the missing shoes and things getting moved around, as suddenly connected. And it dawns on her that maybe she's been blind to something else happening. Maybe someone is breaking into my apartment. So for the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk to see if there was any indication of somebody breaking into her apartment at any point. And there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut. The only thing that stood out to her was when she woke up in the mornings, her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a smell she was used to. It was like another person's smell, and it really freaked her out. She decided, it's time to tell my parents. And so when she tells her parents and she's describing out loud what's been going on in her apartment, it's the first time she's hearing herself say this stuff out loud. And it sounds way more creepy and way more scary than it did in her own head. And so as she's telling them, she's becoming scared to go back to her apartment. And her dad picks up on that and says, hey, I'll go back with you. We'll look around your apartment and we'll make sure it's safe and secure. And then on the way out, we'll check in with your landlady and we'll let her know what's going on. So she's brought in and everything's going to be fine. They go back to her apartment, they go inside, and when they walk in, everything looks normal. They kind of do a walk through the apartment, looks normal. But before her dad leaves, he says, hey, let me just do a closer inspection of your whole apartment. Let me look everywhere and make sure there's not like some special way to get in here, just to give you peace of mind. And so he went into her bedroom and he starts looking around and he's lifting up the mattress and looking underneath. And then he opens up her closet, which is this big closet, lots of clothes in there. It's not quite a walk-in closet, but it's big enough that you can easily stand in there. And her father reaches in and splits the clothes and he uses his light to look at all of the back wall, and he pushes on it and he taps on it and he sees if there's any sort of special compartment. There's not. But before he walks out again, he notices a little blurb of writing on the bottom right corner of the inner wall, an area that you could only see if you were standing in the closet looking for strange things on the wall of the inside of this closet. He kneels down to take a look at it, and it's this little tiny blurb of text that says, "Come back here so I can look at you." And the only way you could write it is if you were laying down in this tiny little corner facing the exit of the closet. And that's when her father looks at the bottom of the closet and one of the slats on the closet door was missing. And so in theory, if you were someone that was writing this message, you'd be laying down where your eyes would be looking through that slat right at her bed. Her father put it together and he stood up. He walked out to his daughter and he said, "Come over here." He showed her what's in her closet and he said, "Did you write that?" And she goes, "No." And he goes, "All right, it's time to leave." They walk outside, they go to his truck, and he calls the police and he says, "Someone's breaking into my daughter's apartment." Police show up and using CCTV footage, they capture a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the night, and he clearly has a key. It would turn out to be Olivia's grown adult son named Henry, who lived with her, who apparently, as soon as he saw Kim for the first time, he fell madly in love with her and became very obsessed with her. And he developed this fake relationship in his mind where he believed he and Kim were dating, even though Kim didn't even know Henry existed. She didn't even know he was living with Olivia. She had never seen him before. During questioning, Henry said what he did is he got sleeping pills and he ground them up, and anytime his mother was delivering food to Kim, which she loved to do, and she was always excited about it, so she was talking about it so he would know it was happening, he would put sleeping pills in her food, he would mix it in, and then he knew as soon as it was delivered, she would be asleep, and he would use his mother's spare key to go into the apartment, and what he said he did is he never touched her. He never laid a hand on Kim. Instead, he laid next to her in bed or watched her from inside the closet. So for the 4 months that Kim lived in this apartment where she believed every time she came inside and shut the doors that she was kind of away from society, she could just be alone in her bubble, well, in reality, there was some psychopath just a few feet away from her almost the entire time. When Olivia found out about all of this, she made a point to tell Kim she had nothing to do with it and she was terribly sorry, but their friendship ended. On October 17, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. And so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized. Nothing in the house was stolen. And Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you got to remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles, such as theft, vandalism, revenge, have basically been crossed off. Not to mention, there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches to the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so 2 detectives go and they're sitting outside and for a couple of days, they're not seeing anything. They're not hearing anything. And they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house. They go upstairs. They look around. They don't see anything. They go back downstairs. And as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it. So they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet. And past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in. They both grab this person and they yank this person out. And they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall, but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times. He was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip. And so the house was vacant. And Conies saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Conies saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, then go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Conies leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going to the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, what are you doing in my kitchen? In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Conies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. And if you found today's secret, please let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. The first one to do that will get pinned. If you enjoyed the video today and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a beer, but then give them an O'Doul's. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. After 3 years of intense military training, I had become a Navy SEAL, joined my first SEAL team, which was SEAL Team 2 in Virginia, and I had joined my platoon, my 25-man platoon. We had gone through all this additional training at the team to prepare for deployment, and here I was 3 years to the day, almost exactly, from when I went to boot camp, getting ready to deploy as a Navy SEAL to Afghanistan. But none of that training would prepare me for how intense my first couple of weeks in Afghanistan would be. So the flight to Afghanistan is pretty routine until you enter Afghanistan airspace, when your pilots let you know, hey, you've entered Afghanistan airspace. They turn the lights to red in the inside of the plane, and they get ready to descend very rapidly into the base where we would be landing. You know, we can't afford to be in the air for any longer than we have to be because there's a risk of getting shot. So there's a super steep descent, and then they tell you to stay away from the windows, right? So you're avoiding the windows in case you get shot at. And I remember thinking like, wow, like this is really it. We're here, we're in a war zone. Like we're nosediving into bases to avoid getting shot at. Like it was intense, and I'm in my 20s. Like it was just kind of cool. Then the ramp opened, the back of the plane opened, and we all got out, and we're inside of this very well fortified base. You know, we're safe in here. And immediately I was struck by the just stunning beauty of the landscape. And I remember looking out at all these snow-covered mountains, and I remember thinking like, how is this a war zone? This is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. I don't think I really appreciated just how foreign of a place Afghanistan is relative to where I come from. We get out to our site, and that night they wanted to go, they being the team that we were relieving, they wanted us to go on an operation. We were going to be up in the mountains. And I remember distinctly them talking about the cave systems that were in these mountains. And I remember thinking like how creepy that was, that we would be up on these mountains, walking around. It's so isolated, it's so foreign, and there could be like people hiding in caves that we could accidentally fall into one of their caves. Like it really, really creeped me out. And so I was talking about how creepy these caves were, and the interpreter was like, you know, what's really creepy is back in 2002, there was this fairly well documented case of another special operations unit, the Army Green Berets, coming in contact with a creature in a cave, and they actually got into a battle with it, and they lost one of their soldiers to this creature. And it was fairly well documented, but then it was quickly kind of silenced. I mean, certainly the story was interesting, but I didn't really believe it. Maybe it was some animal, maybe it was some person, whatever it was, there was some explanation to it. It wasn't until now that I actually started exploring different strange occurrences and strange events, and I looked and found some testimony from one of the soldiers that came forward anonymously, who was a part of this operation where they came in contact with this creature in Kandahar. And what struck me about his testimony is it sounds authentic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell that soldier's story, and I'm going to tell the other kind of corroborating witness stories as well, to try to give you a picture of what happened in Kandahar in 2002, and you can be the judge if you think this is fact or fiction. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's what my channel is all about, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that interests you, I would encourage you to please gently ravage the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3 to 4 weekly uploads. All right, guys, let's get into the story. In 2002, an Army infantry unit just vanished. They were on patrol in the Kandahar mountain range in Afghanistan, and they stopped using the radios. They stopped calling in. No one knew what was going on. They didn't call in a TIC, which stands for Troops in Contact. Basically, any military unit, if you're out on an operation and you start getting shot at, you radio in to your higher command, hey, troops in contact, or TIC, which signals to them, you need to get aircraft on standby, you need to get ready to send reinforcements, they need to be ready to support you. But they only do that if you signal that you're in a TIC. And it's, a lot of people, if anything, will call it in too early. You know, units are known to call it in almost prematurely sometimes. And so the idea that a unit would vanish without calling in a TIC or any sort of communication about any gunfight or any ambush or anything, it's a little bit strange. And so they disappear. The Army decides that in order to find them, because this is obviously a really big deal, they would get their most elite unit, so the Army Green Berets, that's their very elite special forces, they would send them out to find this missing unit. And so one soldier that was a part of that elite special forces detachment, who just goes by Mr. K, he would come forward years later and tell the story of what happened once they were tasked with this mission. So they leave via helicopters and they fly out to the Kandahar mountain range, about 4 clicks, so 4 kilometers about, from where they believed was this infantry unit's last known location. And so they land and they start doing this fairly methodical search through the mountainside. They knew that they were in enemy territory, and at any time they could get into a gunfight, they could be ambushed. There's all these cave systems all over these mountains. And so it's slow moving to begin with. Plus they're looking for this lost infantry unit. So it's just a very slow movement through the mountains. And so over the first few days, nothing really happened. They didn't come in contact with the enemy. They didn't see any sign of this missing infantry unit. They just walked along the mountains carrying a bunch of gear, and that was it. At some point, they noticed a little bit farther ahead that there was this distinct pathway leading up the mountain and kind of around the corner. And it looked like a goat trail. There were lots of goats that would run around the mountainside, and it looked like a very well-developed goat trail. And they decided, let's just go up there. If nothing else, we can go up onto wherever this leads us and maybe look down across the other side of the mountain and see if we can see anything. And so the team starts making their way up this goat trail. And as soon as they start making their way up, they start noticing that there are little pieces of American military equipment on the ground. There are pieces of radios, like whip antennas and housing of the actual radio itself. They found military-style backpacks as well, and they started finding pieces of uniforms that belonged to the missing infantry unit. They knew based on the patches that were on these uniforms. So as they're walking up this trail of broken equipment and uniforms, they start seeing some bone on the ground. They didn't know if it was human bone or what. They start seeing broken bones scattered on their way up to this kind of plateau. And so now the Special Forces team, I mean, they're incredibly well trained. I mean, I'm not just being biased here. I mean, the Army Green Berets, the Army Special Forces, they're very similar to the Navy SEAL teams, which I was a part of. 2 different units, no doubt, but very much peers. And the level of training you get in handling situations like this one, now granted, this one's pretty unique, you're so well trained that when things start getting dangerous, it's like your training just kicks in, and everybody's does. And so I would imagine that when they saw this, what they were thinking is, this was an ambush. This infantry unit was ambushed, and we're probably coming up on the ambush site. And so they're, taking defensive positions, and they're moving slowly and very tactically up this mountain, and they're keeping their weapons pointed at the leading edge on their way up to the top of this mountain. They get to this plateau. It's like a flat section of the mountain, right? It's like a steep mountain, and there's like this little shelf almost. And there's more equipment scattered and more bones scattered across it. And there's all these cave entrances right in front of them. It's as if they were intentionally placed so that they fed out onto this shelf. And so they start moving towards the mouth of the caves, and they realize, without even getting very close, that even though the mouth of these caves are pretty large and everybody could go into the cave, there is a steep drop-off. Like, you'd walk in and then it just goes straight down, and someone kind of peered over the edge and couldn't see how far it went down, and they decided that it was just too dangerous to go in there, because clearly something happened here where American lives were lost, based on the tattered uniforms and equipment. And so let's just pull back and take up defensive positions looking at the entrance to all of these cave entrances. And so as leadership goes down kind of out of the fatal funnels, if you will, outside of these caves, Mr. K, who's the guy who's told us this whole story, he said he's looking at one of the entrances to the caves and he sees a flash of movement inside of the cave. And he looks over at it. He doesn't have time to react to it or anything. And all of a sudden a spear comes flying out of the cave. This big, massive lance comes flying out, and it goes right through one of his teammates whose name was Dan. And so Dan's down. And so the whole team saw that. They didn't see who threw it, but they certainly saw the spear hit Dan. And so as they're shocked and just keeping their weapon up, wondering what's going to happen, out runs this, by Mr. K's account, a 12 to 15 foot tall man with a red beard and red hair down past his shoulders, comes charging out, howling like a war cry. He's got animal skins for clothes. He just looks super dirty. And he runs over to Dan to pull the spear out and probably use it again. And the rest of the team at this point is broken out of their shock of what they're seeing, and they start engaging this giant. And the giant didn't really have a chance to fight back. And in 30 seconds, the giant is down too. So Dan's down and the giant is down. And the whole team is like, what just happened? So after the dust had settled and all the shooting had stopped, they went to check on Dan, and Dan had passed away. And so they called back into higher headquarters, and they're trying to describe what happened. A very large, possibly human creature threw a projectile that hit Dan. And so they sent 2 helicopters out, one to retrieve Dan and the team, the other just to hoist up this very large human-like creature because they wanted to know what it was. And they struggled mightily to get the netting around this big creature. It ended up weighing over 1,100 pounds. It had 6 toes on each foot, and it had 6 fingers on each hand. They load it up, they string it onto this helo, and it takes off. And the team gets into the other helicopter, and they go back expecting to be debriefed as soon as they get back to base. The helicopter with the giant would fly to an airfield, and they would meet up with a crew of a C-130, which is another big military aircraft. The pilot of that craft would publicly say that he remembers seeing a 12 to 15 foot tall giant person with 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. And he would say that's what he saw, even though it was later redacted and made top secret. Mr. K and his team, they flew back to the base to be debriefed. And so they had to provide an after action report. It's something done in the military. You go out, you do any operation, you come back, and you write up what happened. And so Mr. K and his team decided to just be honest about what they saw. And so they described it again in detail, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. It came out, it threw the spear, it hit Dan, it's this horrible situation. And once they submitted it, their leadership said, you got to rewrite that. We're not going to accept that. So Mr. K said they ultimately rewrote it, and it just sounded like a typical engagement in the mountains with the enemy. And it was made top secret, and then they never saw it again. And that was it. Mr. K said that he and the rest of his team also had to sign non-disclosure agreements to not ever talk about what they saw. And they never got any word about what actually happened. What did they do with the body of the giant? And they just never got any clarity out of it. It was just basically made top secret, redacted, and they were told don't talk about it. So it would take until 2016 when Mr. K finally just said, you know what, screw it. I'm gonna go public with what I saw because my friend died and they're acting like, this didn't happen, but it did happen. And so that's why we have this detailed report of this mission where they came in contact with the giant of Kandahar. I don't know how I feel about this story. I do think that if there was a place in the world that had the ability to mask or hide giants from being seen by the prying eyes of the human population, it would be Afghanistan. There were times when I was walking around out there that it felt like I was walking around on another planet. But either way, you do have one soldier who was killed by something out in the mountains of Kandahar, and his own teammates say this is what happened. And you have multiple corroborating witness testimony, but a lot of it's been made top secret and redacted, and so we don't really know what happened, or at least us commoners don't know what really happened. So I'd love to hear what you think happened, whether you think this totally happened and it's true, or if you think it was a hoax. If you enjoyed this story, if you would, please gently ravage the like button and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications because I post stories like this one 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your deal, well, then you've come to the right place. That's going to do it, guys. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is johnballen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen, and you can reach me on there as well. That's going to do it, guys. Take care. Today's story is about a famous Hollywood actor who did something truly horrific, and surprisingly, not that many people know about it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button their favorite food, a burrito, but separate the meat, cheese, rice, and sour cream into 4 distinct sections before rolling it up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Before we get started, I want to give a special shout out to Billy Jensen, who is a fantastic true crime investigative journalist who wrote the article for the LA magazine called The Secret Life of Johnny Lewis. That article was used extensively in the making of today's video. So thank you, Billy. Johnny Lewis was only 7 years old when he landed his first acting role. Granted, it was only a bit part in an obscure escalator safety video, but it was a start. From there, Johnny appeared in dozens of commercials, including with Pizza Hut, before someone recognized this kid has real talent, and he earned appearances on the hit TV shows Seventh Heaven, Malcolm in the Middle, and Drake and Josh, which were really big in the late 90s and early 2000s. In 2001, when Johnny was 18 years old, he had made enough money from acting that he was able to leave his parents' home in North Los Angeles and move into a new home right in Hollywood with a bunch of other up-and-coming actors and actresses. By 2006, when Johnny was 23 years old, he was riding high. He had landed several more big TV roles, like a recurring role in the show The OC, which was very popular in the 2000s. And in 2006, he was dating the mega pop star Katy Perry. And although their romance was relatively short, apparently it was very intense because Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were apparently about Johnny. But Johnny's real rise to stardom occurred 2 years later in 2008 when he was cast as the character Half Sack on the critically acclaimed motorcycle drama Sons of Anarchy. While the show made him famous and fabulously wealthy, Johnny was growing concerned with the direction the show was taking. He felt like it was becoming too violent. Johnny liked reading poetry and studying philosophy and staying up late drinking tea and playing chess. He did not like acting out scenes of gratuitous violence. It just wasn't who he was. So after being on the show for 2 seasons very successfully, he was a very popular character. He went to the writers and said, "You gotta write me out of the script. I can't do this anymore." The writers were totally caught off guard and begged him to stay, but he had made up his mind, and so in 2009, his character was killed off. After leaving Sons of Anarchy, Johnny decided that he wasn't going to pursue any serious acting roles for the time being. Instead, he wanted to focus his time on writing his first novel, which was about this musical genius trying to make his way in the world. And so he started asking around to see if anybody he knew of a quiet place he could live and write out of. And his photographer said, "I think I know the place." It was called the Writer's Villa, and it was this beautiful house with 6 bedrooms for rent right outside of Hollywood. Over the years, it had become a sort of safe haven for up-and-coming actors and actresses still looking to land their big break. The reason it developed this reputation was because of the owner, Kathy Davis. She was this wonderful woman who really understood how difficult trying to break into Hollywood was for all these people that stayed at her house. And so she would look after them and make them food and offer them rides, and she would stay up late and listen to their frustrations and be a shoulder to cry on if they didn't get the part they wanted. Many of her tenants, who went on to be big Hollywood stars, would later attribute their success, at least in part, to the time they spent with Kathy at the villa, which they remembered as being therapeutic and soothing. Even though Johnny had already had his big break in the Sons of Anarchy, he loved the idea of living in such a peaceful place that that seemed to cater to eccentric artists like himself. So in April of 2009, Johnny called Kathy and requested a room, and she said, absolutely, you can stay on the second floor in the red suite. After moving in, Johnny would tell his friends that the writer's villa was just as amazing as he thought it was going to be. And Kathy specifically was just as wonderful as everyone said she was. He actually struck up a friendship with her almost immediately. Everything seemed to be going really well for Johnny in his life until a few months later, he found out his girlfriend, Diane, was pregnant. Although this totally screwed up his plans for his novel, Johnny was really excited about being a father, and so he decided to move out of the villa and in with Diane, who lived nearby, to help take care of their child. 9 months later, on April 6th, 2010, Diane gave birth to a healthy little girl named Culla May, and Johnny and Diane fell madly in love with her. But unfortunately, Johnny and Diane's love for each other faded quickly after becoming parents, and before long, Johnny had moved out and back in with his parents. Not long after that, Johnny and Diane became embroiled in this really vicious, long custody battle over Culla May, which ultimately Johnny lost, which was devastating for him. A few months later, in October of 2011, when Johnny was still living with his parents, he decided to take his motorcycle out and just go ride around and clear his head. And so he drove for about 2 hours to the west of LA out into the desert, where he lost control of his bike and he crashed. After getting to the hospital, his injuries were determined to be relatively minor, except they were concerned he might have a head injury. However, after testing negative for a concussion, he was said to be okay by doctors and he was sent home. But when he got home from the hospital, he was not okay. He was a totally different person. Johnny's father, Michael, immediately noticed the change in his son's behavior. He just started acting really weird and erratic, and his thoughts weren't always coherent, and he was really agitated all the time. It was just very obvious that something was off. And it made Michael wonder, perhaps my son did get a head injury from that motorcycle accident, and the doctors just missed it. And so Michael scheduled 2 separate MRIs for Johnny to go to, but for whatever reason, Johnny refused to go. Around this time, Johnny's friends began to notice his strange behavior when in December of that year, he was at an acting class and he began speaking in a vaguely British accent. And everybody in the class noticed it. And eventually someone said, hey, why are you doing that? And Johnny was like, what? And just kind of shrugged it off and acted like he wasn't doing that. A few weeks later, on the morning of January 3rd, 2012, Johnny was at his parents' house and he was sitting in the kitchen while his mom was making omelets. And Johnny just kind of abruptly says, I'm going to go out for a walk. So he gets up, he's only got his pajamas on, no shoes on. He walks out the door, and as he's walking down the road, he gets maybe 10 or 15 feet away from his parents' house when he hears someone screaming, like they're screaming in distress. And he thinks it's coming from the apartment that was right next to his parents' house. And so he breaks into the apartment, but there's no one in the apartment. It's totally vacant. And so as he's in this apartment, wondering what's going on, the 2 men that owned the apartment, they came home and they see Johnny standing there, and they told him he had to leave immediately. And instead of leaving immediately, Johnny grabbed a nearby glass bottle and he charged at them and hit them both over the head with the bottle before they managed to restrain him and hold him down until the police showed up. Johnny claimed he was acting in self-defense, but the police didn't believe him. And so they charged him with trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon, and they sent him to jail. When Johnny's father was finally able to come to the jail and bail his son out, it had been 8 days, and in those 8 days, Johnny had been moved from general population to a psych ward because he was banging his head against the inside of his cell. And at one point he had tried to jump off of a balcony, and he was just generally acting unhinged. And so when he was discharged, on his paperwork, a doctor at the jail had commented that he thought Johnny at one point must have had some sort of head injury that had made him act this way, and he was definitely suicidal. When Johnny got back to his parents' house, he was an absolute wreck. Physically, he had 2 black eyes and his face was all puffed up from the confrontation he had with those 2 men in the apartment. And emotionally, he was so distraught that he wouldn't let anyone in his family come near him. He just holed up in his room and just told everyone to stay away. He also became extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he was turning off all the lights in his parents' home. And then when they would eventually just turn them back on again, he would get agitated and turn them all off. And then finally, he just disabled his parents' fuse box. But despite Johnny's obvious issues after coming home from jail, over the next few weeks, he did actually seem to be improving to the point where at the end of January, so about a month after he came home from jail, his parents allowed him to move out and go live on his own in Santa Monica, California, about 30 minutes away. But as soon as he was living on his own, his troubles started again. On February 10th, so about a week after moving into this place in Santa Monica, he was arrested for punching some random stranger in the head outside of a yogurt shop, but he was ultimately released on $20,000 bail. A couple of days later, Johnny, fully clothed, just walked into the ocean, and when he was pulled out, he had to be brought to the hospital to be treated for hypothermia. A couple of days after getting out of the hospital, he was arrested again, this time for trying to break into a woman's apartment in Santa Monica. He claimed he thought it was his friend's apartment, but nobody believed him, so he was brought to jail and then released on bail again. After this second arrest in Santa Monica, Johnny's parents finally convinced him to go see a doctor about this potential head injury they thought he got from that 2011 motorcycle crash. Even though that jailhouse doc had suggested Johnny had a head injury, he had not officially diagnosed him. So Johnny needed another doctor to officially diagnose his head injury so they could begin to treat it. But the doctor Johnny wound up seeing did not suspect a head injury. Instead, he suspected schizophrenia or bipolar, which are two very serious mental disorders. And so he prescribed some medication to Johnny that would treat both of those disorders, and Johnny was on his way. Johnny refused to take the medication and refused to go see another doctor, and so his condition just continued to get worse. Johnny was still facing serious jail time for the break-in and assault against those two men in the apartment next to his parents' home. And so Johnny's lawyer was trying to get a deal done where Johnny would go to a mental health treatment facility for a year instead of going to jail for a year. But Johnny was so confident these charges would just get dropped and he'd be allowed to go back to his life and live the way he wanted to, that he fired his lawyer and he represented himself in court. But the charges were not dropped and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. However, the jail he was sent to was so overcrowded, they reduced his sentence all the way down to only 6 weeks. When Johnny's father finally came to pick him up from prison on Friday, September 21st, 2012, Johnny was at an all-time low. Even though he had only been in jail for 6 weeks instead of the year he was supposed to be there, it was clear that amount of time had done an enormous amount of damage to him. And so on the car ride home from prison, Johnny just kind of sheepishly asked his father, hey dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa and just see if there's any way I can move back in? And Michael's thinking to himself, I hadn't thought of that, but the writer's villa was the last place Johnny was when his life was still in order. It was probably the last place he was happy. And so he probably has attached a lot of fond memories to that place. And so that's a great place for him to go. And so as soon as they got home, Michael called Kathy Davis and explained the situation and said, is there any way he can stay there? And she said, absolutely. The red suite is still available. I'll go up and make the bed right now. I can't wait to see him. Johnny stayed with his parents that weekend. And then on Monday, September 24th, he packed up his stuff and he moved back into the villa. 2 days later, a 70-year-old man named Dan Blackburn, who was actually neighbors to the writer's villa property, he was looking out his front window at this man who was standing out in the road. He only had on jeans and red shoes. He had no shirt on and he was very sweaty and he was just kind of frantically pacing around the road, and he had never seen this guy before. And so he's just kind of poking out behind his curtain, watching him to see what he's going to do next. And after about 15 minutes of this kind of strange pacing in the road, this guy turns and walks directly towards Dan's property, goes right up to the front step and starts knocking on the door. Dan was definitely a little bit concerned, but he shut the curtain, he walked over to the door, and he looks out the peephole, and there's this guy standing there with bright blue eyes that are all wide, and he's looking at the peephole as if he can see through and see Dan, but he can't. And so Dan reaches down and he opens the door just a little bit and he looks out, and the guy outside looks at him and goes, "Hi, I'm John. I'm your new neighbor." It would turn out John was Johnny Lewis. And so Dan opened the door a little bit farther and he looks at him and he goes, "Hi, John, nice to meet you." And before the two men could have any sort of conversation, Johnny just abruptly turned around and walked away. And so Dan is totally puzzled by this strange interaction he's just had with Johnny Lewis. And he's watching him as he just walks back to the road, he walks back over and goes inside the villa and disappears. And so Dan kind of shrugs it off. He shuts his door, locks it, and goes back to his morning routine. About 30 minutes later, Dan is doing his own thing in his house when he hears his wife outside screaming for him to come outside. And so Dan runs out the front door. He goes into his driveway, which is between his property and the writer's villa, and he sees his wife is standing on the driveway, horrified, pointing up towards the back of their house. He looks down, and back near their back deck, Johnny Lewis, is standing on top of the guy that Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck. Johnny is just raining blows down on this guy. He's got a piece of wood, too, that he's hitting him with, and the worker is sitting there trying to shield himself. There's blood all over him, and Dan instinctively just runs over to Johnny. Johnny's not seen Dan at this point. Dan gets right up to him, and he grabs him by the shoulder, and he tries pulling Johnny off. He's screaming at Johnny to stop, but Johnny just seems totally unfazed. He's just destroying this worker. And so finally, after Dan yanks on Johnny hard enough, Johnny jumps up, turns around, and levels Dan square in the face. Dan falls to the ground, and when he looks up, Johnny is just standing over him, looking at him with no expression on his face. It's like he didn't know what he was going to do with Dan next. So he just stood there and stared at him. But Dan wasn't going to waste any time. He jumped up and he clocked Johnny square in the side of the head, but it had no effect on Johnny. He still just stared at Dan, completely expressionless. And so Dan grabbed a nearby lawn chair and practically broke it over the head of Johnny. But again, it had no effect on Johnny. He just stood there completely expressionless, staring at Dan. And so at this point, Dan just grabs the worker who can barely stand, and he runs back down the driveway. He grabs his wife, and they run towards the house to go inside. And the three of them manage to get inside the house. And as they're shutting the big, heavy door, Johnny comes bounding up, and he gets right in front, and he jams his arm in the space between the door and the wall. So they can't close the door because it's getting stuck on his arm. And so all three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the painter, are putting all of their weight on this huge wooden door onto Johnny's arm. And Johnny is just trying to grab them the whole time. And so finally, the three of them start raising the door and slamming it as hard as they can on Johnny's arm. And finally, after several hard blows to his arm, Johnny retracted his arm, and they were able to shut the door and lock it. And so at this point, Dan's wife and the painter ran around the house, closing every window, locking every door. Meanwhile, Dan went to the side window that looked out towards the writer's villa property, and he got his phone out and he called 911 as he's looking out the door looking for Johnny. And so after he tells 911 what's going on and he hangs up, Johnny suddenly just appears running down his driveway as if he's running back towards the back deck. But he stops almost right in front of Dan's window. He turns and he starts running towards the villa property. He jumps over a fence that's at least waist height, just jumps clear over it. And then he gets to this huge wooden fence that surrounded the entire villa property that was at least, 8, 9, 10 feet. And he very easily just jumps, grabs the top, and catapults himself right over the top, and then disappeared inside of the villa. Within minutes, the police showed up and they went inside the villa, and they could not believe what they found. Based on the evidence, this is what investigators believe happened. After Johnny, for the first time, walked up to Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I'm John. I'm your new neighbor." After that, he turned around and Dan watched him as he left his property and made his way back and went inside the villa. Once Johnny got inside the villa, he made his way up to the second floor and he went into Kathy Davis's room where she was sitting. Now, Kathy most likely turned and saw Johnny standing in the doorway. He's got no shirt on. He's sweating. He looks totally crazed. She probably was not scared. Instead, her motherly instincts kicked in and she probably said, "Hey, are you okay? Can I help you? What's going on?" And as she probably stood up and made her way over to make sure he was okay, Johnny, for reasons no one understands, proceeded to beat and kick and strangle her. And then when she fell to the ground and was totally helpless, Johnny proceeded to either stomp on her skull repeatedly, or he hit her over the head repeatedly with a rusty hammer that was later found in his bedroom. But no matter how Johnny did it, he managed to severely fracture her skull, and that's what ultimately killed her. After killing Kathy, Johnny tracked down her beloved cat and killed the cat the same way. Afterwards, Johnny ran out of the villa, and that's when he spotted Dan's house painter just sitting outside, and he walked over to him and just began beating him. And just like the attack on Kathy and her cat, this attack on this house painter appeared to have no motive as well. After Dan came outside and managed to fight Johnny off, and then when Dan went back inside the house with his wife and with the painter, Johnny stood outside for a few minutes before running down Dan's driveway and then hopping over those two fences right in front of Dan, and then Johnny disappeared inside of the villa. Once Johnny was in the villa, it's believed he climbed up to the upper patio or onto the roof of the villa itself, and from there he either jumped or fell to his death on the driveway below. His death was officially ruled an accident, not a suicide. After the news broke about what had happened at the writer's villa, everybody assumed Johnny must have been on some really hardcore drugs. That's the only explanation for why someone would act the way he acted. But when his toxicology report came back, it showed he had absolutely no drugs of any kind, legal or illegal, in his system. He was completely sober at the time he committed this horrible crime. Some believe Johnny really did have some undiagnosed head injury from that motorcycle accident, and this head injury is responsible for his violent outbursts. Others disagree and say the head injury had nothing to do with it. Johnny clearly had some undiagnosed mental disorder. Maybe it was schizophrenia, maybe he was bipolar, maybe it was something else, but it was this mental disorder that led to these violent outbursts. But to this day, no one knows for sure why Johnny did what he did. All we know is an innocent woman and her cat were needlessly killed. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button their favorite food, a burrito, but separate the meat, cheese, rice, and sour cream into 4 distinct sections before rolling it up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like this flannel, like this hat, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. If you're interested in MrBallen merch, go to shopmrballen.com. Also, follow our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen for upcoming deals and promotions. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. This story was kept top secret by the US military until 2004. The story itself is unbelievable, but it's the twist at the very end that you'll remember. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's hand sanitizer with lubricant right before they go out to run some errands. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Chichijima is a small Japanese island about 500 miles south of the Japanese mainland. During World War II, the Japanese put a base on this island, and they put 2 radio towers at the top of the 2 mountains on the island. These radio towers became integral to the Japanese communication and surveillance operations in the Pacific during the war. And so at that time, the island was heavily fortified with up to 25,000 troops and huge anti-aircraft guns. Because of the island's obvious strategic value to Japan, the Americans wanted to take it from them. But American military strategists advised against that, saying that any amphibious landing of this island would result in massive casualties for Americans, and the Japanese would likely just repel the attack anyways. And so the Americans decided to go with the next best thing, which was to attempt to bomb the 2 towers and cut out their communications. So in June of 1944, American aircraft carriers, which are those huge ships that planes can take off of and land on, they headed for the island of Chichijima. And once the island was completely surrounded, the Americans began launching their pilots to try to take out these towers. But the Japanese fought back in a major way. And despite taking heavy casualties on their side, they repelled every American air raid and kept them from bombing their towers. After several months of these failed missions over Chichijima, the American military leaders were incredibly frustrated. They knew this was going to be a difficult mission, but they didn't expect it to be this difficult. However, this island was so strategically important that the Americans knew they had to just keep on sending pilots in until they took out these towers. And so in September of that year, the Americans were back to planning another raid over Chichijima Island, and one of the pilots selected to go on this particular raid was a 20-year-old named George, who actually was the youngest pilot in the United States Navy at the time. But despite his age, he had actually flown in several combat missions already and had actually been shot down already and had to eject into the ocean and was subsequently rescued. On the morning of this raid, George, along with his two-man crew, which was his radio operator named Dell and his door gunner named Ted, they boarded the plane, and then at 7:15 a.m., George and his crew took off, along with dozens of other American aircraft that were part of this operation. George immediately climbed above 8,000 feet because that would put them outside of anti-aircraft gun range. And so the way this mission would work is all these pilots would fly over the island, and then in order to drop their bombs, they would have to dive down below 8,000 feet and then manually drop their bombs and then try to get back up above 8,000 feet and out away from the island. And so George had run missions like this before, and so he was one of the first to actually make that dive down to the island. And as soon as he went below 8,000 feet, the island just erupted with anti-aircraft gun fire. And so all these rounds are coming up, flak is popping all over the place, and George almost immediately notices the side of his plane gets hit. But the plane's stable enough that he decides he's just going to keep on diving down and complete the mission. And he's yelling back to Ted and to Dell to hold on, and they get all the way down to 3,000 feet when George releases two 500-pound bombs that are direct hits on the radio tower he was assigned to bomb. But at this point, George's plane is now engulfed in flames. It can barely fly, and so George is again yelling at Ted and Dell to hold on. He's pulling back on the lever, and he begins to turn himself away from the tower out towards the water, and he manages to fly away from the island, but he can feel the plane starting to go down. Now, George had previously been shot down before, and what he learned from that is how important it was to fly as far away from the enemy as you possibly can before you bail out of your plane. Because if you bail too early and you land in the water right near where the enemy is, you'll just get captured. And so George was holding on to that lever and keeping his plane up as long as he possibly could. And so he's flying and getting lower and lower and lower and closer to the water, and Ted and Dell are yelling at him that they gotta jump out. Meanwhile, outside, the other planes that had sustained damage, the other American planes, their crews are already bailing out. But George is saying, no, hold on. And he keeps going farther and farther until he's so close to the water that it's practically too late. And then he gives the order to jump out of the plane. George abandons his controls. He leaps out the door and he hits his head on the back of the plane as he leaps out. But his chute would open up right before he hit the water and it would save his life. As soon as George hits the water and he comes up for air, he's under his parachute. And so he's trying to get his parachute away to get a breath of air. He disconnects his parachute from his shoulders. He clears the parachute and he's looking around and he sees his plane that is now being flown by no one go crashing directly into the water. And so immediately he's looking around for Ted and Dell's parachute to make sure they're okay, but he doesn't see any parachutes anywhere. However, George notices a life raft from his plane had miraculously just landed like 10 feet away from him. So he swims over to the life raft, he climbs inside, and once he's in there, all he's thinking about is Ted and Dell. So he's yelling for Ted, he's yelling for Dell, but he's not getting a response. And so George turns around in the raft. So now he's facing towards the island, and to his horror, way off on the horizon, right near the edge of this island, are Japanese patrol boats that are speeding in his direction. He knows they're coming to get him and the other people that had jumped out of these planes. And so George turns back around, he leaps onto his chest on the front of this raft, and he starts using his hands to swim as fast as he can away from this island. The whole time he's screaming out for Ted and Dell in hopes he's going to find them. Little did he know that both of them had not survived the crash. One had not even jumped out of the plane and had died on impact, and the other had jumped out, but their parachute had not inflated. And so George is swimming as fast as he possibly can, and he's yelling out for Dell and for Ted, and he's looking, but he doesn't hear them, he doesn't see them, and he knows that not only is he not going to find his friends, but there's just no way he's going to outswim these boats. And so at some point, he just turns around and sits in the raft, and he's looking towards these patrol boats, and he knows that at some point they're going to come up here and they're going to capture him. And all he can think about is how guilty he feels about Ted and Del. And he starts second guessing his decision to keep that plane flying as long as he did and make them bail out so late. And he's thinking, I probably got them killed. And then he thought about his wife and he wondered if he'd ever see her again. And then he turned towards these Japanese boats that were much closer now, but still fairly far away. And he began mentally preparing himself for captivity. But before he could be captured, American aircraft come storming in overhead and they go flying past him towards the island and they start dropping bombs and strafing these Japanese boats that were coming out to get George. And so George is thinking, oh my goodness, what luck. He turns around, he gets back on his chest and he starts swimming as fast as he can, trying to get away, knowing that these boats are totally preoccupied with the aircraft overhead. And for 2 hours, George used every ounce of strength he had to swim as far as he possibly could away from this island. But at some point, he was just so unbelievably exhausted, he just could not paddle any farther. And so he's just laying on this raft when he hears the sound of something coming out of the water. And he turns and he sees the periscope of an American submarine coming out of the water. And seconds later, the crew of this American submarine comes right up alongside him. They grab him out of the raft, they put him in the submarine, and he was saved. Besides George, Ted, and Del, there were 8 other American airmen that had to bail out of their aircraft because they were badly damaged following this raid. And so originally, those 8 people were not recovered and they were believed to have drowned at sea. But that actually was not true. The US government figured out fairly quickly what happened to them, but the details of what happened to them were so gruesome, the government decided they did not want to tell anyone. They especially didn't want to tell the parents and loved ones of these 8 airmen because they believed if they heard the true account, that would be too traumatic for them. And so they made the details of these 8 deaths totally top secret. But 60 years later, in 2004, an author named James Bradley discovered transcripts from a post-World War II Japanese war crimes trial held in Guam, where Japanese military leaders confessed to what they did to these 8 captured Americans. This is the true account. Unlike George, these 8 other airmen bailed out almost immediately after they got out over the water. And so that placed them in the water very close to the island. And so before the American aircraft could come in and save the day, like they did with George, these 8 airmen were scooped up by the Japanese and brought back to the island. The Japanese soldiers on this island for the past several months have been getting constantly bombed by American aircraft, inflicting a very high casualty rate. And so these soldiers hated the Americans and they wanted revenge against the Americans. And so suddenly you have these 8 American prisoners on this island with no one to protect them. And so what do you think happens? The Japanese decide they're going to exact their revenge on these 8 men. Within 24 hours of being captured, the 8 men were kind of huddled up in one section of the island when one of them, Marv Mershon, who was 19 from Long Beach, California, was grabbed by a Japanese commander, stood up and moved to the central area within their military camp, and they tied him to a tree. And this commander encouraged all of the other soldiers to beat and kick Marv. And so all day long, soldiers were coming up and just beating the crap out of Marv, and Marv is tied to the tree. He can't do anything. And these 7 other prisoners are forced to just watch because they can't do anything. And so that night, the same commander comes back and he unties Marv from the tree and he tells these 7 other prisoners to stay where they are. And this commander and several other Japanese soldiers, they take Marv and they march him away from the group into the jungle and they march him over to this freshly dug grave. And standing next to the grave that Marv would have seen is this Japanese soldier carrying a sword. And so Marv is told to walk up to the edge of this grave. They tell him to kneel down in front of this grave, and they let him smoke a final cigarette. And apparently Marv very calmly smoked the cigarette, and when he was done, the man with the sword put a blindfold on Marv and then told Marv to extend his neck. And as soon as he did, he was beheaded. Afterwards, they buried him inside of this grave. That night, one of the high-ranking Japanese generals on the island, a man named Yoshio Tachibana, who was an alcoholic and was notorious for his sadistic tendencies with prisoners, he was sitting around drinking, having a good time, when he decided that his soldiers, they needed to prove they had what he called the fighting spirit. And the only way they could show they had this fighting spirit was by consuming human flesh. And so Tachibana ordered his his soldiers to go exhume Marv from his shallow grave. And then Tachibana sent over one of his surgeons, and he told him to remove Marv's thigh. So the surgeon goes over, he surgically removes Marv's thigh, he gives it to one of the cooks, and the cooks, they make this huge meal using Marv's thigh, and they serve it to Tachibana and his other high-ranking officers and some soldiers. And apparently, Marv's thigh tasted so good with soy sauce and with sake that Tachibana ordered his soldiers to go back and cut more meat off of Marv, which they did. Within a month of Marv's execution and consumption, Tachibana decided that he wanted to eat more human flesh, and he wanted his soldiers to eat more human flesh because he and a number of the other officers were superstitious that this could make them stronger and it would be good for their stomach and it would be good for their health. And so they decide they're going to kill more of the American prisoners and eat them. And so they brought the 7 remaining American prisoners out to the rifle range. And once they were all out there, one of the Japanese officers grabbed 25-year-old Floyd Hall from Missouri. They pulled him out of the group and they walked him over to the middle of this range and they tied him to a wooden stake in the ground. And once he was in place, Tachibana, who was there, he ordered the other Japanese soldiers to work on their bayonet work on Floyd Hall. And so one by one, these soldiers would go up and plunge their bayonets into Floyd Hall's chest, into his stomach, until he ultimately died. Once he was dead, Tachibana, who had brought along his surgeons for this very reason, he sent them out to remove Floyd's liver and his gallbladder right in front of the now 6 living prisoners. They're watching this happen right in front of them. And then once his liver and gallbladder have been removed and wrapped in cellophane paper to preserve them, the surgeons walked back and stood on the edge because they knew this was not the last execution of the day. And so the other 6 prisoners are looking around, wondering what's next. And then one of the commanders walks over and he grabs another one of the prisoners. His name was Earl Vaughn. He was 22 years old from Texas. And as soon as he was grabbed, he knew he did not want to face the same fate Floyd did. And so right away, he became defiant. He wanted to die more quickly. And so he began yelling Semper Fi at the Japanese. And he kept extending his neck and pointing up at his neck, indicating he wanted a clean and quick death. Behead me. And so the Japanese, they tried to strap him to this wooden post because they wanted the other soldiers to work on their bayonets with him, but it was just too difficult with Earl. He put up such a fight and he kept putting his neck out that finally one of the soldiers did pull him down and he was beheaded. And then again, the surgeons came running out into the field, and in plain sight of the now 5 remaining American captives, they removed Earl's liver and his gallbladder and then wrapped them in cellophane paper to preserve them. And then they took Floyd and Earl's organs and they went back to the cooks to have them prepared. And that night, all the high-ranking officers on the island feasted on Earl and Floyd. Within a few days of Floyd and Earl's murders, the other 5 captives were also executed in a similar fashion, one by one, in front of their comrades. And 2 of those remaining 5 were also consumed. And unfortunately, one of those 2 was not executed beforehand. Instead, they had pieces of their body surgically amputated, and then those pieces would get cooked and eaten. And when they were done eating them, they would just come back and cut off more and more and more until there was nothing left to eat. And at that point, that prisoner was executed. They did this in order to keep their meat fresh. After the war was over, 34 Japanese soldiers, including General Tachibana, were tried for war crimes for their atrocities they committed against these 8 prisoners of war. They were all found guilty and they were all hanged and buried in unmarked graves in Guam. The other men on the island that witnessed these atrocities and didn't do anything about it, or participated but in some sort of secondary way, they were also tried for war crimes, found guilty, and sent to jail, but all of them were released after 8 years. George was 80 years old when he finally learned about the atrocities on Chichijima Island that he so narrowly escaped. He, like everyone else that was learning about this, was horrified and disturbed, but more than anything, George felt a deep sense of guilt for having survived. But what we can all say for sure is that George did not waste his second chance at life. George H.W. Bush would go on to become the 41st president of the United States of America. And his son, also named George Bush, would go on to become the 43rd president of the United States of America. 2 world leaders who would change the course of history forever, who never would have been if George Sr. had bailed out of that plane near Chichijima Island just a few seconds earlier. Think about that. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's hand sanitizer with lubricant right before they head out to do some errands. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. We are now selling merch like this flannel, like this hat, and you can buy some of your own at shopmrballen.com. You can also check out our Instagram page called Shop Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In 1988, a waitress who was living in Central Florida had just begun her shift at a local diner when she's standing in the middle of the restaurant and her heart just starts racing like mad. Now, she had not been running around or doing any heavy lifting, so it didn't make any sense. And so kind of startled by what was happening, she just turned around and went straight into the bathroom and sat down in a stall, waiting for this sensation to pass. But as she sat there, her heart just continued to beat like mad, and then she began to feel tingling in her feet and in her arms. And it was at that moment that she realized she was having a heart attack. Except she wasn't. Something much, much worse was happening to her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come ballroom dancing with you, but when you get out on the dance floor, just start stomping all over their feet, but don't acknowledge it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Peggy Carr's life had never been very easy. She was born in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida to parents who were deaf and who had almost no money. So from a young age, Peggy had to go to work, except the only jobs she could land were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous, like overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways where she would waitress there all by herself. But Peggy never complained about her job prospects. Instead, she just took whatever jobs were available because she knew that she and her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in a dangerous environment, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior to make sure no one attempted to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation amongst her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take crap from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also warded off potential romantic partners that might have been interested in her, but were kind of intimidated when they interacted with her. But eventually, one man would cut through Peggy's defenses, and they would fall in love, and they would get married, and they would have 3 kids together, and everything was great until it wasn't. The marriage would crash and burn, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was a mid-30-somethings divorced mother of 3 teenage children who had to work overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was working or when she was out in public, when she was behind closed doors at her home with her kids, they saw the real side of Peggy. And that side was just kind of sad. I mean, life had just been kind of hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she had kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, were not bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Perry Carr. Perry Allen, who just went by his nickname, Pie, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take crap from anyone, and like Peggy, he had been kind of forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny central Floridian rural town called Alturas, and he was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a number of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pie, they start dating, and right away, Peggy's kids notice this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she's all smiles, she's so happy. It seems like Pie is the knight in shining armor that's come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pie and Peggy would get married, much to their children's excitement. And then after the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pie and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly, even though they were living in a fairly small house. And so all 5 of them were kind of all over each other, but they got along great. And it was kind of fun to have so many people in this house all the time. It was kind of crazy and hectic, and overall, the house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in with Pie and his kids, Peggy and Pie started to have marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just totally vanished, and in its place was nothing. They basically completely resented each other, and everything they did upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows each other, that Pie was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. And so Pie, he denied these accusations, but Debbie totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse, and the more they fought, the more a wedge was kind of driven down the center of this blended family, where Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pie's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pie and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these 2 families together forever. In late October of 1988, so 7 months into Peggy and Pie's now very rocky marriage, Pie suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This was not a planned trip. He just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip. I'll see you later." And so Pie, he leaves the house, he gets in his truck, he drives off, and then a little while later, Peggy and her daughter, Sissy, they both get their things together, and they head out and they get in Peggy's car, and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. And so they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, they get their things on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant. She had not done any heavy lifting. There was no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. And so initially, Peggy tried to just ignore it, thinking that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom, and she sat in one of the stalls. She shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart only continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling, and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. And so as she's sitting there feeling these symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she washes her face, she kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom, she goes right into the staff break room, and she tells her daughter, I think I'm having a heart attack, but don't worry, I'm just going to go home, I'm going to lay down. If this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I want to take it seriously, so I'm going to leave for the day. And so Sissy is looking at her mom, really concerned, but Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person that's going to sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back, and please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and her arms and her legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving. And then Peggy slipped out the back door. She got in her car and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty, so she just went inside. She made her way to her bedroom and she lied down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne because his mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a time ever that he saw his mom napping, even when she was sick. And so concerned, he went into her bedroom and she was facing away from him. And so he kind of jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale. She was sweating. She obviously had not been sleeping. She was gritting her teeth and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort. And he said, "Mom, geez, are you okay?" And she would say to him, "Oh, no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something. I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off." And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll be just fine. And so Dwayne said, "Okay, well, let me know if you need anything." And so Dwayne began to walk away, but his mother would actually flag him back and she would level with him and she would tell him that actually something is wrong here. I feel like someone has poured fire down my veins in my arms and in my legs, and it is excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really serious. And so Dwayne began telling his mom that you got to go to the hospital. We need to get Pi here to drive you to the hospital, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here. But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit reserved about it. She thought maybe she could just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi would return from his hunting trip. He would come in the house, and right away, Dwayne would run over to him. He would explain to Pi, "Hey, this is not normal. My mom never, ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital." But Pi would actually say, "She's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. She'll sleep it off." But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, "Okay, I'll take her to the hospital." And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under doctor's care at the hospital, she no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling quickly. And so after she's been admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and to the other family members that had assembled, and they asked them, "Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" And they all said, "No, she just suddenly started feeling this way." And so the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy, she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or it just came back that everything was normal. And so they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her. And so they're at a loss. They don't know what's wrong with her. And so without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and begin monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms would come down. While she wasn't back completely to strength, she was able to speak again. She was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable. Her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities. But overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. And so Peggy and her family, they drive back to their home, and initially, everything's okay. It seems like she's on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart starts to race again, and before long, her arms and legs feel like they are on fire. Now, Peggy and her family, they know that the doctors don't know what this condition is. And so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy, again, was suffering from this horrible thing. But going to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to sit at the house and wait it out, the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse, to the point where she literally was completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms when she was at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive, or just showed that, nothing was wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what's causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son, Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting the same symptoms as Peggy. Their heart was racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through, and they all came back negative or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition, and suddenly it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in, and he remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. And so he told his colleagues, they ran out and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy. And sure enough, the next day, the results came back and all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who despite being on all these painkillers is still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her, "You're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to make you as comfortable as possible and then try to save your boys." Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma, and then 4 months later, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And then at that point, she passed away. As for her two boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. We've all been there. You're the host for the big summer barbecue, the guests are on their way, and you realize right at that moment as you're pulling it out of the oven that you've overcooked your zebra cornea souffle. With only minutes to spare, you leap head first out of your kitchen window, shattering the glass, cutting your body badly, and then you run into the nearby jungle and you tackle a wallaby and you knock a few teeth loose, you grab those teeth, you run back to your house, you die, you die. You dive back into your house head first through a different window, you cut yourself up badly again, you get inside your kitchen and you whip together a wallaby teeth salad just in time as your guests are coming in the door and right before you pass out from blood loss. Crisis averted, right? Wrong. Zebra cornea souffle and wallaby teeth salad, they're not good. But what is good is HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal service that delivers actually good tasting food right to your doorstep. Between menu items like cheese stuffed burgers and grilled salmon with balsamic tomatoes, you are not only going to wow your barbecue guests, but also you're going to avoid jail time for poaching wallabies and zebras, and you're going to avoid expensive medical and repair bills from all the jumping out the windows you were doing. HelloFresh recipes include pre-portioned ingredients, which means less prep time and less wasted food. HelloFresh also offers a line of kid-friendly recipes that are perfect for families that are looking to try something new as the summer winds down and we get ready for school to start up again. So, if you're ready to stop choking down zebra corneas and wallaby teeth, then you need to sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Okay, back to the story. There is an international organization called Mensa. That's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% out of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived, in Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, that Mensa chapter, what they would do is they would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. So one or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. And so once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. And so this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter, and they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Trapal. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida, and George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And, critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself, she's moved to a brand new area, she's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends, and so she probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could, and George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could, and he was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. And so they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character, and everyone's also looking at this so-called perfect crime that George had come up with, that he was also very proud about, and he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. And she would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon, and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body, and how you can get it and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. And so that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great and they would head home. And then over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please, let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry, and so they said, you know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not. And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car, and as soon as they had drove off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things and she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. And so before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time, around the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning. And one of the symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning, but the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys are lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs. Way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do. Your body is basically already dead. You're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family has been poisoned, and so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick, and so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company, and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note that said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all going to die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police have ruled Pi out as a suspect, They didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gilek, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her in to the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friends and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious. They were too noisy. They were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than Dr. Carr, she had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pi and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pi and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pi reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle topping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a topping machine at his house. And so with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house. And then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on the kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook. And then he left the house and that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend, the murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning? And how'd you learn about poisoning? And what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house. They searched it top to bottom, and in the garage, they found George's chemistry equipment, and nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive and he is still on death row. As for his wife, Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come ballroom dancing with you. But when you get out on the dance floor, just start stomping all over their feet and don't acknowledge it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, and we upload on Mondays and Thursdays. You can find that podcast on YouTube under the name MrBallen Podcast. You can also find it on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation, which makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my wife, my family, my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crime. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels called MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.